Hello there, kia ora. Things must be looking bad in those internal National Party polling numbers because this week the Prime Minister's floated the spectre of asset sales. Now let's be real here. There hasn't been a national government in the last 40 years that hasn't floated this idea, then gone ahead and done it no matter how the public felt about it or who would be impacted, or the negative outcomes it would cause. And it's based on two highly flawed beliefs, according to this 1989 report from Treasury. The first is that private enterprise is inherently better at running businesses than government. And secondly, we can only get out of debt or get debt under control by selling assets to do so under the pretense that our debt to GDP ratios are so high we wouldn't be able to borrow more for fear of collapsing the entire economy. Both of which ignore the basic fact that enterprise undertaken by the government's actually done for the greater good, not for profit. Governments are not, this is really fucking important, businesses. A government's not there to turn a profit for shareholders. It's there to look after the population it serves. It doesn't matter whether or not it's a health sector or, quantity valuations of some sort. It's there to serve the public in some way. And sure, it can't do that if debt to GDP ratio is wildly out of control. But as was the case even after borrowing the money that helped keep the country afloat, as well as a number of businesses and people alive during the height of the COVID pandemic, and even after that increase in borrowing from Nicola Willis last year during the budget at a higher amount than 5 out of 6 of Grant Robinson's budgets, our debt to GDP ratio is ridiculously small, and it's played up to scare the kind of idiots who believe the stereotype that National is good at business, so must be good at running the economy. We don't have a health sector, for example, to make money. We have a health sector to look after people when they need it. A poorly run health sector focusing on profits cuts costs, and that causes issues with access to healthcare services. It might be access to emergency rooms, it might be hospitals with poison black mold in the walls. I wonder who was in charge of Auckland DHBs when that happened, and if we're going to revisit it later in some kind of callback. Anyway, the trick here is to look out for the kind of language that the government wants to use to soften the public up, and they have a really specific turn of phrase that we have heard a shit ton from the chaotic caucus gremlins this term. Are we getting good value for money? Oh look, there's Simeon Brown saying it yesterday about state-owned enterprises, of which he's now the minister in charge of. Now, the timing of this actually isn't that much of a shock on Friday. While everyone else was at Ratana Pa, David Seymour got up and gave his State of the Delusion speech to party faithful, using phrases like woke mind virus, a term popularized by Mr. We did not see a Roman salute just then, did we? Seymour used it to vilify academics and the people who felt forced to leave the country in record numbers because this government has treated the place like Lester Levy did to Middlemore Hospital. See, callback. Oh, and just how have asset sales gone in the past? Well, if history is to be repeated, then it will actually fit the dynamic of messaging this government is really good at. Credit when there shouldn't be any and ignore any inconvenient truths from their actions. When John Key sold off 49% of state power companies in 2013 and 2014, he estimated that they would raise $10 billion in revenue. Treasury said the official target was actually closer to 5 to 7 billion. They made 4.7 billion. In the first year after sales, it was estimated to have lost the country $3 billion in dividend payouts. Between 2020 and 2022, those sold power company shares saw a 60% increase in profitability. But last year, we saw several warnings from those gentailers about a lack of power supply caused by a lack of investment in production infrastructure. That comes from private enterprises apparently being better at running businesses than governments. And governments have a bad habit of playing spin doctor with asset sales. Ask yourself, is it an asset sale or a share float? Which was a question asked a number of times throughout 2014 and 2015. But why now? Why are the National Party rattled enough now to consider floating the idea, and the media so confused about how to frame it, and the Herald so determined to make it seem like a good thing? Well, there's a number of reasons, like the fact that ACT and its proxies at Hobson's Pledge have been working really hard to tell National voters that National isn't being shitty enough, especially during the hearings on the Treaty Principles Bill. Sure, They're driving away record numbers of people and caused the worst recession since the 90s and breaking up the classic national plans of vilifying beneficiaries, making people homeless and promising tax cuts that'll fix it all. But according to Hobson's pledge, they're not worthy of your vote because they won't support Mr. 8%'s demands for a referendum on the Treaty Principles Bill, and occasionally do things that aren't totally anti-Māori. They're being attacked by proxies that they'd aligned themselves with in the past, like the Taxpayers Union or NZCPR, who now constantly criticise and complain about the actions of the National Party. And that's on the Nats for thinking that ACT-linked lobby groups would do that to them and think it wasn't going to hurt them and work bloody hard to convince voters that ACT is the choice for them. So, like the time they slumped in the polls and dragged out John Key to talk about his love of Donald Trump, or the time they slumped in the polls and got John Key out to talk about people warming up to Christopher Luxon, it seems that there might be another slump in the polls, and this time they just can't get hold of John Key. Maybe he's, busy or something. So they've gone back to the tried and tested well of National Party ideas. Only their most indoctrinated fans will think are original, beneficial, or positive.